Hello and welcome to a new episode of Other Record Labels. I'm your host, Scott Orr. Thank you for joining us, where we talk about the art and culture of running an independent record label. And today, this is not a sexy topic. We're talking about biowriting, but it is a very important topic. And it's a topic that we actually have to tackle every time we're putting together a press release for a new album, or signing an artist, or putting together a website, or filling out a social media bio. There's so many times where this task comes up, and I know a lot of us dread it. Artists hate to talk about themselves. We always kind of pass the buck onto them and make them write something about their new album. And so we're going to dive into how we can easily tackle this topic. And this is part of our Industry Insider series. And I'm talking today with Sammy Maine, who is a writer, an author, an editor at Goldflake Paint. And she also does biowriting for artists and for record labels. And so it's such a pleasure to have her on the show today. And I'm telling you, you really have to listen to this episode, because I know that all of our listeners encounter the responsibility of writing a bio. And there are some incredibly wise nuggets in this episode. And so I really want to make sure that you listen. And I think you're going to find this really helpful. Speaking of helpful, after I recorded this episode, I put together some of these ideas. And I basically put together this one sheet of some tips and a little checklist and some examples of bio writing. And I've included that in our record label toolkit. So if you've already downloaded our record label toolkit, which has some other things, some other checklists and some other resources in there, then you're going to need to download it again to get access to this new one page on bio writing. And so go to otherrecordlabels.com/toolkit and download that now. And I've included some updated piece on how to craft a bio for your artists.
Let's roll right in. I'm really excited about this topic because in the grand scheme of things, like of all of the components of releasing a record and promoting a record, writing a bio for an album or for a band is a pretty small piece. But for some reason in my mind, it's like such a linchpin. Like it's such like a wrench that can just completely ruin everything or slow down the process. So the reason I wanted you to come on here and why I think we need to talk about writing bios and kind of camping out on that subject for a bit is it's something I dread as a label owner, as an independent artist. It's something I'm not good at. Maybe I put in like 10 seconds into it sometimes. The problem is that like the need for it comes up all the time, like whether it's on our website or writing grant applications or press kits. For something I dread so much, I just have to do so much of it. So why are these things so like why are bios so painful for dummies like me?
Well, I think bios are a chance for to see your art and your craft objectively, and I don't think you can actually do that, no matter how hard you try. And so I think that's why a lot of artists struggle to do it themselves. Some don't. Like some do their own artist statements that could turn into bios. But I think to step back from your own piece of work and to say, okay, well, what is this about, is actually quite difficult for a lot of artists. So I think bringing in an outside perspective to help the artist talk through the themes on the record can really help them to understand what this piece of work is about. And actually the conversation will bring out things that they may not have thought before. So yeah, I think that might be why it's so painful. I don't have the complete answer to that because I find them quite easy to do. So
that's good. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting point about a fresh set of eyes. And we do that in the music industry with mastering and bringing in mix engineers to listen to something after we've worked on it for so long, to bring a fresh set of ears to. So it totally makes sense that we would do that on how we describe the record.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, bios are the thing that is able to create a bridge between the artist and the listener. And it allows the artist to see their work in a new light and to take a step back, because as we both know, so many artists work on albums for sometimes many years.
Sure.
And I've spoken with a lot of artists who say, oh yeah, you know, I've been working on it for a long time. Some of these songs are like 7 years old. And they're kind of, you know, sometimes they're a little bit sick of it by the time it actually comes out. And so they're not really excited to talk about it, or they're not really excited to deal with it. You know, it's kind of sad that it takes a long time, especially with COVID. You know, there's been so many pushbacks for album releases. Right. And, you know, a friend of mine, their band had to wait 2 years longer than they thought for an album to come out. And talking with them about the release and asking them if they were excited, they were like, well, you know, kind of, I don't know anymore. And it's kind of like really heartbreaking, because, you know, these people put their all into these albums and these EPs. And so I think, as you said, like bringing in an outside perspective, like mastering, or someone who creates the album artwork, or someone like myself who writes bios, can get them really excited about it again, and can kind of ignite some more energy into it. And, you know, it points to areas about the album that the artist will want to discuss, whether they know it or not. And so it's good practice for interviews they might be doing in the future.
True.
Yeah. So, and a lot of artists, especially on independent labels, or if they're self-releasing, may not have a lot of experience with interviews. And I find when I do bio calls, that they're quite nervous to talk about the album. But it's quite a safe environment, because I see writing bios as a total collaboration. I, of course, do a lot of the brunt work, and I'll be doing all of the drafts and everything like that. But as we're chatting, you know, I'm just saying to them, this is your story, and I'm just the portal to tell it for you. So that seems to relax them a lot more. I do get a lot of frantic emails after calls being like, oh, I meant this instead of saying that, and I don't know why I said that, and I forgot to say this. And, you know, they don't get that chance when they do interviews with publications.
Right.
And so it kind of helps them sort their head out a little bit.
That's a good point. What should the goal of a bio be? What do we hope it accomplishes?
I think it, in my experience and in my intention with writing bios, it's to tell the story of what this record is about. Because that sounds really kind of like a blanket response, but I mean it in the way that musicians and artists, and I count myself as an artist in writing, and so this might just be my perspective, but I think what we're all doing is just striving for connection and understanding through our art. We're trying to show our perspective of the world and share it with others, and hopefully connect with others through that perspective. And so it's just really important to... I'm sorry, what was the question?
No, what should the goal of the bio be? Like, what are we hoping it accomplishes of a good bio?
So a good bio, and I hope I write good ones. It just accomplishes and cements more understanding about the record, because I'll be honest, like I've been on both sides. I've been working as a PR and working as a writer, and discussing bios with a lot of my journalist friends, and a lot of them, including myself, and I'll be honest, like we don't read all of them that we get sent in our emails. Yeah, you know, we get so many emails, and it's really hard to put the time in and the focus to be like, okay, I'm just going to read this whole page about this album. Often I will read a bio if I'm doing an interview. I mean, I will always read the bio if I'm doing an interview with an artist, because the bio is there to tell us what this album's about and what the artist wants to discuss about it. And it's kind of like there to be a jumping off point for questions in interviews. And it allows the artist to kind of shape the narrative around the press for it.
Right.
Because bios are the only thing that, I mean, I'm talking about smaller artists. I'm sure huge artists actually approve a lot of interviews that come out.
Okay.
But it's not the norm for smaller publications and smaller artists. It's actually quite bad taste to do it to a journalist and say, I want to read it before it comes out and approve it.
Right.
So bios are the one thing that artists can control what is said about the record.
That's a good point.
And so that's a good first base to send to journalists so that they can understand where the artist is coming from in the first place. And then that is a great jumping off point for a good conversation about it.
I want to ask you this. I've been fascinated recently about how with Instagram and Twitter, often our first interaction with new music as music fans happens visually, whether it's we see an album cover, a video still, an album review, or even just, for me, it's just a tweet from a journalist or someone I follow. It's something that we see that entices us to go listen. What are your thoughts on this, and what does it say about the importance of the written word describing music?
Yeah, I am someone who loves the visual aspect of music. I'm obsessed with album artwork.
Same, me too.
I think it's, and I've written about it quite extensively. Any chance I get,
Great.
I put my hand up and I'm like, please. And I always ask about it in bio calls, because of course it's the first thing that people see. It used to be the first thing that we see in a record store before the internet. And so it's the visual presentation of a sonic world, which is just so important. And a lot of people just don't seem to be that interested in it, which I find really fascinating.
Same.
I'm just like,
I totally agree. It blows my mind.
And it's just, some of it is, it's so beautiful and it's telling a story in a visual way. And it's funny that I was thinking about this the other day, how sound, when we hear a word or we hear music, our mind will often like paint a picture for us and we'll see something. And so I like to think of that with albums. It's like, that's what you're supposed to see when you listen to this music. You're
right. That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, that's getting deeper than I expected. But so visually, I mean, were you asking like what the role of the written word compares to the visual?
Because sometimes it's like we're talking about album artwork for sure. That definitely pulls me in, and same with like product images of like well-designed vinyl variants or cassettes. But oftentimes I'm also just pulled in by a review, a written review, or even just a tweet. Somebody saying, describing a record in such a way that I'm like, I got to hear this.
Yeah. And it's funny, like talking about emails that journalists get, like myself. The first thing we see about an album is the subject line of an email.
Okay.
And so that's almost like the tiniest bio you could ever imagine.
Oh, so is that important?
For me, I'm going to say personally, it's very important for me.
Interesting.
If it's an artist I've never heard of, I will look at the subject line and be like, do I even want to open that email? Because I'm going to be real and say I do delete a lot of emails without even opening them.
Oh.
Because I get so many.
Yeah.
And
sometimes
I'm
you can just
scanning
tell,
the email.
Right?
Yeah, and sometimes you just tell, like, especially if they say songstress in the subject line, I'm like, I'm not going to open that. Which is, probably unfair on the artist because they probably didn't have any say in that. But there are definite no words that I can't even look at. So yeah, I think of the subject line as a mini bio. And then in the email itself, the whole bio of the album is not going to be in the body of the email, because that's just too long.
Okay.
Because a bio is roughly, like 4 or 5 paragraphs. And so you need to be thinking about having a very short bio, like a tiny bio, which is the subject line of the email, and then a very short bio that's in the kind of body of the email, that's in the sort of press release aspect of it. And then usually the bio is attached as a document.
I see. If they want to go deeper.
Right, exactly. But I totally agree with you with like tweets, especially, or Instagram stories, that one sentence can really pull you in to an album and want to check it out. And unfortunately, like, I don't like to, in bios, I'll never say this person sounds like this person.
Yeah, right.
Because I think that just means what the artist is trying to do. It's their art. I agree that most things are a remix of other things. But ultimately, it is a new piece of art that is their perspective of whatever they're inspired by. But I think it's really lazy to say, oh, for fans of
I know
whoever.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the fence with that, because sometimes as a music fan, it's nice for somebody just to kind of spoon feed me music that I know that I'm going to like.
Right.
At the same time, I totally get what you're saying. It is kind of lazy, and sometimes it can turn you off when you might actually like the music.
Exactly. And but I will say sometimes I'm counterpointing my own point. I will say in the subject line of some emails, if it's a new artist, they will sometimes say, for fans of, so-and-so releases gracious, gorgeously melodic folk album for fans of blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, well, I really liked that album, so I might look at that.
So, no, that's interesting. I also, one of the things that does, one negative, and I can see a lot of pros and cons, but one negative is that if an artist is writing it themselves, I don't like when an artist compares themselves to another artist necessarily, because it plants a seed in my mind that, like, especially when I see like Bon Iver used to describe an artist's work, I'm like, oh, you're just really influenced by that artist, which is essentially meaning like this is just going to sound like you copying him, which it often plants this negative seed where I'm like, uh-oh, here we have another sound-alike artist,
Yeah. And I mean, one thing to get away from that with an artist writing about their own album is to actually get, especially if you're a very small label owner and you can't afford to pay someone to write a bio, which is just, that's real, especially right now, is to just interview the artist yourself and just have a chat about it. And then just send the journalist the transcription of that conversation.
Wow, that's great advice. What makes a conversation better than like them jotting down what they think the album means?
Well, I think saying it out loud often brings up things that they wouldn't write down. As a writer, I'm such a self-editor and almost to my detriment, because I will be doing it as I'm going and I'll be so like self-critical of what I'm writing.
Yeah.
Whereas when we're talking like we are right now, you're just kind of a lot freer and thinking more broadly, I think, and you're not being so careful to edit what you say, for better, for worse, because sometimes you'll be like, oh God, why did I say that?
Yeah.
But it's often helpful anyway to just do that, have a conversation, have the transcription, and then the artist could maybe write something themselves.
That's incredible advice, because you're so right. We become, when we try to be elegant in writing, for those of us who are non-writers, we just sound like garbage. But we're probably more elegant in the way we speak just naturally.
Right.
Yeah, that's such great advice.
Yeah, and often there's, when you're writing, it's a very lonely process. And when people are writing these albums as well, it can often be a very lonely process, especially in the very beginning. And you can really get in your head about what it's meant to mean or what you're trying to say, and it often just make you really frustrated and hate what you're doing even more. And so just bringing in not even a fresh perspective, but like a label owner or a friend, it wouldn't have to be the label owner talking with them. It could be the person who recorded it with them, or it could be their partner, or it could be anyone that they're kind of comfortable with, and just having that other person to bounce ideas off of can just bring up themes that they might not have even thought about had they just been sitting in a room and trying to write about what this whole album means that they've been working on for years. It's kind of a big ask as well. So.
No. That's good advice. I want to ask you, we're talking a little bit about pitching these albums, and this is for the most case where these bios are being used. And so we talked about, and this is so helpful, the idea of a subject line as a mini bio. And then you get into a little bit more in-depth inside the email. When an artist or label is pitching a new release to publications and writers like yourself, can you walk us through a little bit about what really works for you? I know that all of my artists, and myself included, wish that we could just put an album link and let the music speak for itself, but it isn't that simple, is it?
No, unfortunately not. Yeah, I mean, I have been doing this for I don't even know, 12 years at this point.
Wow.
Yeah, 13 years. I don't know. I'm getting on a bit now, but
Congrats.
yeah. And I've formed really lovely relationships with PR and label owners who really understand the kind of music I like and really understand the publications I'm working for. And so it's really tedious. And I know this because I did PR for a punk label in Bristol called Specialist Subject.
Yes. Yeah. I've had Kay on the show. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Kay is just the most wonderful human being.
Totally.
Yeah. So they took me on in 2018, I think. And I worked for them for a little while doing PR for their albums. And so I know how tedious it can be to individually pitch each person to their taste, write about which feature on their website it would work for, or which playlist, or which it's just hours and hours and hours go by trying to do that. And I will just say spreadsheets are a godsend.
I agree.
And color coding is a gift. But it makes a world of difference to be pitched something that is to you and you only. Not you only as in the album is only being
I get
but
you.
just the body of the email.
Yeah.
Some people just spell my name wrong,
right?
Or pitch me on Instagram when my email is in my Twitter bio.
Yeah.
And that really puts me off, which is a shame because I just immediately don't even want to engage with it. If someone spells my name Sammie, I'm like, well, my name's it. You can just Google me and it's everywhere. So I know it's tedious, but I think personalizing the emails is so important, and really getting to know the publications that you're pitching to instead of just blanket pitching the same email to everyone.
Yes.
Because you may get one or two bites, but I think there is more of a chance of people getting back to you if it's personalized. And then that way you're also growing relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's great advice. I've heard that a lot. I have found that to for myself as well to be the case. It's the worst advice to hear, because what you want to hear is that BCCing 1,000 writers is the best way to do it. but you're right. The personalized emails, but the funny thing is that you can either send 1,000 blanket emails or 10 personalized emails, and the 10 personalized emails are going to have more effect than the blanket ones. So it actually could almost be the same amount of work.
Yeah, and I mean, it was heartbreaking for me at times, where, especially working with special subject, where I would put days of work into personalized emails and I would get nothing back.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
And that's a very real, that's our reality sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's nothing about the music itself. It's usually people are very busy. People are getting, we have to remember there's humans behind everything. But one other thing that I did like to do when looking for people to pitch specifically is just, like we said, we don't like saying this album sounds like this artist.
Yeah.
But if it really does, just Googling who's reviewed albums of that artist or who's reviewed or interviewed that artist, and you can say, hey, I really loved your Bon Iver review. And this album we think is really, going to be up your street. So
that's a good
and then
point.
That way, that's an added like personalized thing, because it's like saying, oh, I've actually read your work and I think you're going to really like this. Because like you said, sending 1,000 emails to writers who might not even like the genre of music you're sending them, so it's kind of pointless.
Totally. Let me ask you, what was your journey into writing about music like? Can you kind of give us a little bit of the genesis behind all of it?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of regret it now, but
I agree.
I mean, it's changed so much since I graduated college in 2010.
Right. Okay. Yep.
I wanted to write about music since I was about 13 or 14. I knew that was what I wanted to do with my life.
How did that come to you as a 13-year-old?
I was obsessed with music magazines. Obsessed.
Like what?
Especially Enemy.
Okay. Yeah.
I would get my Dave at the corner shop would always put one aside for me every Wednesday. Came out every Wednesday. And I would go and get it. And I would just read it after school, cover to cover, on that Wednesday night.
And there was still the heyday too, right? Like where they'd come in cellophane with a CD, and they were huge.
Yeah. And that, I mean, those years as well, there was a lot of, especially running up to like just before I went to college, there was the huge like surge of indie bands. The Strokes were massive.
Yes.
And then all the Baby Strokes bands came out and everyone was obsessed with them. And so was I, I was totally obsessed and in love with all these bands. And I was really obsessed with writing in general. When I was little, I would just write stories and stories and stories. And that was how I made sense of the world, was to write about it. And so I really wanted to combine the two things that made me feel alive, which was music and writing. And I was just hell-bent on doing it. And I just was so obsessed with this idea of being able to go to shows and write about it and connect with people in that way. It wasn't necessarily that I wanted to give my opinion. I just wanted to tell stories. I really wanted to tell the story of why this art was being made and who would connect with it and why it exists and what it can do for us. And unfortunately, the reality slapped me in the face a few years later that that's not really what sells or what gets clicks. So, I mean, I did a lot of internships when I was growing up. I did one at Enemy, which was very exciting for me as an 18-year-old. And I got food poisoning from their cafe and missed 3 days of my internship.
Like your first day you got food poisoning?
I got like the second day I got food poisoning. So I was like, oh, right, maybe this is like trying to tell me something that I shouldn't be going into this career. But, I was fine. I stayed with a cousin of mine who's actually a music PR now. And I went to a bunch of different talks about writing. And then at my college newspaper, I was arts and culture editor. And it was just such a thrill to have to to be able to review albums that were sent to me. I'd never been sent advanced copies.
Oh, yeah.
And this was a time when they were still sending CDs.
Sure.
And I was very, very excited.
Yeah,
it was
I bet.
just like the best thing in the world to me.
Those CDs with the hole punched, the UPC was punched in the hole and it said like, do not copy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It was like, you will be sent to prison.
Yeah, the FBI logo.
Yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh, like putting it in my backpack, like contraband. But yeah, so I was arts and culture editor at my uni newspaper, and then the magazine editor, and I just was like insatiable with going to shows and writing about them. And you know, then I graduated. I was working in a record store. I got made redundant. I was desperately trying to get a job in this field, and then the job that I did get was not in music journalism specifically. It was for a graphic design website.
Okay.
But while I was working there, you know, and again, I got to write about album artwork sometimes, which was great. So while I was working there, I did start freelancing for a lot of different music publications. And I was also hugely involved with Tom at Goldflake Paint, blogging almost every day.
Right. Awesome.
And really trying to build that brand with him. I hate calling it a brand, but I guess that's
fine.
what we have to call it.
Sure.
And I was just writing, unfortunately, I was writing for free a lot because it was already apparent that it was not a field that paid well. And it was already deteriorating. There was already publications closing. There was already websites being taken down. There was already, I think NME went from weekly to bi-weekly. And I could see it happening, which was really heartbreaking because I'd worked really hard to get into that industry and it felt so far away. And I was living in Bristol. I wasn't living in London. And everyone told me that I had to move to London to really thrive in this industry. And I just couldn't do it. I couldn't live in London. It didn't fulfill me as a place. And so I stayed in Bristol. And eventually I was able to leave that office job and just completely freelance for music publications. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I have to do a bunch of other jobs on top of freelance writing because that's the reality.
Yeah. That's the reality for a lot of freelancers in a lot of industries.
Yes. Yeah. Especially, you know, it was bad before COVID and now it's just, I don't even know what's going to happen. There was a lot of freelance budgets just completely cut at the beginning of COVID last year. And now also we're seeing so many more musicians interviewing other musicians, which I don't know how I feel about that.
Oh, really? That's a thing?
Yeah, definitely. You know, with the bigger pop stars, and
like you mean
bigger publications,
like a podcast, or as like an article.
Oh, yeah.
I see.
Like, you know, I can't even think of, you know, Taylor Swift interviews Paul McCartney was one.
Right. Okay.
And I think conversations between artists are definitely interesting and worthy of publication, but it's also just like we're struggling enough as it is. Can someone give us some work, please?
Yeah, they don't need the work. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and so it's been really heartbreaking to see the status of music journalists. Just I don't feel like they're as respected as they were before. Which, you know, they shouldn't be the gatekeepers of who gets coverage and, you know, who gets airtime or page space.
Yeah.
But
well,
I do think there was something quite beautiful about how music journalists were really, you know, people had their favorite music journalists and anything that they recommended, you know, they would listen to. And I feel like that's less and less the case these days. I worked as a news writer for NME, and it was a lot about just getting clicks, you know, and that's the reality for a lot of publications, to just survive and be able to create the content that they actually want to create. which is just like really sad. So I'm very, very thankful to be an editor at Goldflake Paint and to be working with Tom and Hannah.
Yeah, that's totally incredible thing.
Yeah, thanks so much. We're just really trying to counteract the clickbait.
Mm-hmm.
It's just there's something to be said for patience and pause, especially when you're listening to an album. Like, rarely do we put an album on and just lie on our bedroom floor anymore.
Right.
Yeah. And so I like to think of Goldflake Paint as the magazine equivalent of doing that still. Yeah. And it's there to tell the story of these people. That's why I got into this field in the first place. I wanted to tell stories, and I wanted to tell the stories that would connect people to these artists and to the world around them and make them feel less alone, you know?
Well, I'm hoping, I totally agree. And I'm hoping there'll just be a pendulum swing where, very much in the way that physical media started to come back and thrive when digital came. And hopefully the same thing with the written word and with journalism, where, a lot of us start to value it more whenever we're trying to sift through all of these tweets from random people,
Mm-hmm.
I still will, when a band that I love is releasing a record and they get a New York Times feature, I'll print off the whole, I haven't done this in a while, but I'll print off the whole article and just sit around on a Sunday and read the whole thing. So I do love that. I love it.
Yeah, totally. And it's just the magic of that has kind of gone. And I really hope you're right that there will be a pendulum swing. But I will say, as someone so heavily involved in a print publication, we're not seeing it yet.
I see.
So,
I see.
we're trying to get subscriptions and we're trying to stay afloat, and we're just getting by. But if it's got to be people investing in it, but I don't know if people have like the focus or the time to sit down with a magazine anymore.
Yeah, or even to support something consistently.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our financial situations are very dire right now. But there's so many people who, I'm a huge reader of literature. I read like 64 books last year, and I'm obsessed with novels. And again, it's the same thing with writing. It just makes me feel less alone. It helps me to see the world in a new way. It's the same with music as well. And I'll tell that to people, and they'll often say, wow, like I can't even, pick anything up for more than 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's very, I'll have days when I'm like that too. And we're all experiencing this like collective trauma and this collective grief right now. And we're all just doing the best we can. And for some people, they'll find solace in sitting down with something and giving it their full attention. But I know for a lot of us right now, it's so difficult to do that. And it's much easier to distract ourselves with 1,000 different things on a phone.
That's true. Yeah.
So,
totally.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about, what you do with respect to bands and with artists and stuff. Is biowriting something that labels can contract out if they can afford it? And how does that usually work?
Yeah, so I have written bios for big labels, small labels, and artists who don't even have a label. So it works in a number of different ways. The big labels will usually have, like 5 people on CC and be like, we want it to include this, this, and this.
Oh, right. By committee.
We need it done by this date.
Yeah.
And it's very like quite a rigid process with big labels. And part of me is like, is this what the artist actually wants? Or are you just shaping the narrative for them just to try and, mold it into something that sells, which is the reality, and that's fine. But I have to say that's probably my least favorite bio type to do with artists on bigger labels, but they will contract it out, yes, and they will have a budget for it, and they will offer the budget that they have. And then smaller labels, I really like working with, and artists just who are self-releasing, I love working with. And as I said, everyone's financial situation is completely different. So if it is a small label or a self-releasing artist, I will just kind of discuss a budget with them that works for them and for me. Because a lot of people just can't afford to shell out hundreds and hundreds of dollars.
Sure.
So yeah, the process is a little bit different for each type of artist, but I will usually approach it in exactly the same way.
If the most common question, when I'm working with a publicist with a band or something, and we have to come up with a bio, the most common question that comes up when you're writing a bio for new releases: what if my new album or my new band or whatever doesn't have an interesting angle? Like a lot of bands will say, we have 10 songs, we wrote them. I don't know. There's, they can't find the story. How do you address that? That's such a common problem with bios.
Yeah, I think it goes back to these bands and these artists having sat with these songs for years, and so they don't see a theme and they don't see anything special. But it is special just writing music in the first place.
Sure, yeah, that's true.
I think just having a conversation with someone outside of your inner circle, or who was not involved in the process, and just talking about it,
kind of like a therapist.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a therapist. Yeah, just drawing out.
How many bands have you made cry?
Oh. None. I've not made them cry. I've made them very happy most of the time. There was just recently there was a small label owner who I did a bio for, and he replied to it and just said, "This bio rocks." There was a real, it was a real aha moment.
Oh,
and
great.
It's just thrilling to understand what the record is about.
That's beautiful.
So often I really like to be that middle person who can help the label understand what the record's about as well, not just the artist. And then everyone's just more understanding of each other, and it's a much more fun process. So I would say to artists who are struggling, just don't think about it that much. Just don't worry about it that much. You don't have to have, I feel like the way the industry is right now, you have to have this really special thing that was a catalyst in making this record. And I think that's the click, the click culture is like you have to have some like amazing or scary thing that happened. And I've seen that a lot with journalism in general, is that people love to mine artists for their trauma and love to try and bring it out and splay it all over the page. And it's okay if you don't want to do that. You don't have to do that for clicks. Yeah. It's just a trend that I'm really uncomfortable with.
I can tell when it's forced. I feel like I can tell.
Yeah. And so if it's like, hey, I wrote 10 songs and I really love them, then you just can talk about, well, what was it like growing up? And why did you get into music in the first place? And what does writing music mean to you? It doesn't have to be specifically about this album. It can just be about why they do this thing in the first place. And usually you'll get a better answer than I don't know. Because
hopefully,
people have a drive to create, and they'll know what that drive is. It's usually not like, I don't know, I just do it.
Yeah.
Because if they feel that way, then I don't feel like it's gonna last that long.
That's true. Yeah. Well, that's a great, I love the whole conversation thing, because a lot of artists will say to their label reps or to the labels or to their publicists or whatever, they'll just say, I just write music. I don't want to have to describe it or what we talked about at the beginning. They don't want to think about the artwork. Yeah. They don't care about the artwork. They just write music. But I mean, everybody is, for the most part, passionate about what they do. And so having them talk about why it is what they do. I mean, you're totally right. I think you could pull so much out of that.
Yeah. And in an ideal world, we would just put art out into the world because without all this stuff, because I feel like a lot of albums and a lot of books as well, once they're out, they don't really belong to the artist anymore. They belong to whoever's listening to it and whoever's connecting with it. And it was funny, I was talking to an artist the other day. She's a regular at the bookstore I work at. And she's in her 50s and she's just extremely cool. And I just adore her and I just want to be exactly like her in 20 years. And I was, describing some of the struggles I'm having with writing. And she said, that's really dumb. You have to forget that your art is not for you.
Oh, wow.
And I don't 1000% agree with that.
Sure.
But I really appreciate what she was trying to tell me in that moment. And so it would be great to just put an album out, put a book out, and let the art speak for itself. But unfortunately, that's not the reality. And unfortunately, that would mean that like hundreds of people were out of a job too.
Yeah. This has been great, by the way. Thank you so much. If you're open to working with bands and labels, and can our listeners reach out to you? And if so, how?
Absolutely. I would love to work on more bios. It's honestly my favorite thing to do.
Nice.
Because I get to just tell the story and it's not for a publication, it's for the artist.
Yeah,
and that's why I wanted to write about music in the first place. So, you can absolutely reach me. Twitter is a good place to find me.
Okay.
It's just at Sammy Maine, all one word.
Okay.
And my email is there. And
I'll put links to everything in there.
Yeah, so my email's there. That's the best place to find me, and you'll just have to deal with my other tweets that are just me screaming into the void. But
aren't we all?
Yes.
I think it's so amazing to hear it. I mean, this is like talking with a lot of the people that I talk with, but it's so amazing to hear people who are passionate about areas of the job that I hate or that I dread so much. What a beautiful world to have people. And I imagine there's things that I really enjoy doing that are arduous or tedious that other people can't stand. So I think that works really well.
I mean, it takes a village to release an album.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
And so the artist doesn't need to feel stressed out about trying to tell the story by themselves, or the label owner doesn't need to feel stressed out about getting everything 100% right. There are, like you said, there are other people out there who can help. And usually you can find the right person that's going to make you feel all right about everything. And then we just create more of a community. And I think that's what music should be about in the first place.
Totally. Thank you so much for doing this. It's been so great to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks for asking me. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you all for listening. You can find out more about Sammy Maine, and her name is spelled SammyMaine. And you put that all together, and she's on Twitter under that name. And her email is there, and some of her previous work and some of the organizations she's been a part of. And so go ahead and follow her. And if you are at the stage where you're ready to hire someone, then you can reach out to her. And also go and grab our updated toolkit that has our new one sheet for writing bios with some helpful tips and examples in there and some takeaways from this episode with Sammy. Thank you so much for listening. Go to otherrecordlabels.com/toolkit to grab the updated toolkit.